Hello, dear listeners, and a warm welcome to Soft History, the quiet place where the past comes to rest beside you in the dark. Tonight, we are going to travel back across more than 600 years to follow the slow rise and the slow fall of one of the largest empires the world has ever known. Picture for a moment a single small tribe of herders living in tents on the dry edge of Anatolia, owning little more than their horses and their sheep. Now picture that same family, only a few lifetimes later, ruling over 3 great continents at once, holding lands in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa, with the keys to ancient holy cities and the wealth of half the known world flowing through their markets. That is the story we will follow tonight, and it is a story that begins with almost nothing at all. The empire we are going to walk through was called the Ottoman Empire, named after a man named Osman, who lived around the year 1300. From his small beginnings grew a state that would last more than 6 centuries, longer than most countries that exist today. It would rule cities that had stood since ancient times, command fleets across 2 seas, and shape the lives of millions of people who spoke dozens of languages and prayed in many different ways. To understand how a tribe became a world power, and how that world power slowly faded away, we have to start at the very beginning, in a land caught between 2 dying empires, where the future was wide open, and nothing had yet been decided. But before we go any further, I want to take a moment. On this channel, we explore fascinating subjects in calm and careful detail. These journeys are made to help you relax, focus, or simply enjoy the flow of discovery. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Is it day or night where you are? What time is it? Are you tuning in while studying, working, commuting, or simply winding down? Drop your answer in the comments below. It is always wonderful to hear from you. And if you enjoy content like this, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. It helps us bring you more of these journeys. Now let us go back to the very beginning, to a quiet corner of the world where it all started. Around the year 1300, the land we now call Turkey was a place of broken edges and uncertain borders. It sat between 2 old and tired empires. To the west was the Byzantine Empire, the last living piece of ancient Rome, once mighty but now worn thin, its strength fading like a candle near the end of its wick. To the east were the lands the Mongols had stormed through, leaving smaller kingdoms scattered and weak. In the middle of all this lay Anatolia, a wide stretch of hills, dry plains and cold mountains, where small groups of Turkish nomads moved with their animals from summer pastures to winter shelters. These people lived simply. They knew the land by its smells and its seasons, the dust of summer roads, the sharp cold of mountain nights, the soft green of spring grass where the sheep could feed. One of these small groups was the tribe that Osman was born into. They were not famous. They were not rich. They were just one of many bands of herders trying to find a safe place to live in a world where larger powers were always shifting. Their tents were made of felt and could be packed up and carried in a single day. Their wealth was counted in horses and sheep, not in gold. At night, the families would gather around fires, and old men would tell stories of bravery and of journeys, of battles fought long ago in distant lands. The wind moved across the open grass, carrying the smell of smoke and animals, and above them, the sky was wide and full of stars, the kind of sky you only see far from any city. These borderlands had a special quality that would matter a great deal. They sat right at the edge of the Byzantine world, the place where the old Christian empire met the newer Muslim peoples moving in from the east. Life on a border is never settled. There were raids and there were trades. There were quarrels and there were friendships. Men who lived in such places had to be ready to fight, but they also learned to live beside neighbors who were different from them. This mix of war and patience, of strength and openness, would later become one of the deepest habits of the empire that Osman's family would build. But in his early years, none of that had happened yet. There was only a small tribe, a wide land, and a young leader watching the weak Byzantine towns to the west with quiet, careful eyes. It is hard, looking back, to see anything special in those first days. If you had stood on a hill and watched Osman's people move across the plain, you would have seen nothing that hinted at greatness. You would have seen tents and animals and dust, the same as you might see anywhere across Anatolia. The towns nearby paid them little attention. The great rulers of the time never wrote their names down. And yet, in this very ordinary group, something was beginning to take shape. The seed of an empire that would one day stretch across 3 continents was sitting quietly in a felt tent on the edge of a forgotten frontier, waiting for the right moment, the right leader, and the right dream to set it all in motion. Osman grew into a man known for his calm strength and his fairness, qualities that drew others to him. In a land full of small chiefs who quarreled and broke their promises, Osman kept his word, and people remembered that. Slowly, men began to gather around him. Some came because they wanted land and plunder. Some came because they trusted him. Some came simply because following a steady leader was safer than wandering alone in a dangerous time. He did not try to grow too fast. Instead, he took small towns and weak Byzantine forts one at a time, the way a patient man fills a basket fruit by fruit. He let his power build slowly, season after season, never reaching for more than he could hold. There is a famous story told about Osman, passed down through the years, about a dream he had as a young man. In the story, he was resting in the home of a wise and holy man, and as he slept, he saw a great vision. He dreamed that a moon rose from the holy man's chest and sank into his own. Then from his own body a mighty tree began to grow, a tree so large that its branches spread out and covered the whole world. Under its shade lay great mountains, and from its roots flowed wide rivers, and people of many lands lived beneath its leaves. When Osman woke and told the holy man about the dream, the old man smiled and said, it meant that Osman's family would one day rule a vast empire, and that his children's children would be great kings. Whether the dream truly happened or was told later to honor him, it captured something real. It showed how this small tribe came to believe it was meant for greatness. Osman did not conquer with cruelty. He understood something that many warlords never learn, that people who are treated fairly will stay loyal, while people who are crushed will always look for a chance to rebel. When he took a Byzantine town, he often allowed the people to keep their faith, their homes, and their way of life, asking mainly for their taxes and their peace. This made his rule something many people could accept, even welcome. Farmers who had lived under heavy and uncaring Byzantine lords sometimes found Ottoman rule lighter and more orderly. Word of this spread, and more towns opened their gates rather than fight. In this quiet way, Osman's lands grew not only by the sword, but by his reputation, which traveled faster than any army. He also built the bones of a real state, not just a wandering tribe. He gave land to his loyal men in exchange for their service in war, a simple and powerful idea. A warrior would receive a piece of land to live from, and in return, whenever the leader called, he would ride to battle fully armed and bring fighters with him. This meant Osman could raise an army without paying constant wages, and it tied his strongest men to the land and to him. It also meant that holding territory and defending it became part of the same system. Around him, a small ruling family began to form, with sons and trusted companions who could lead in his place. The tribe was slowly turning into something more lasting, something with roots. By the time Osman was old, his name had become something to remember. The state he founded would carry his name forever, for the word Ottoman comes from Osman himself. He had taken a scattered band of herders and shaped them into a young power with land, with an army, and with a sense of purpose. When he died, around the year 1324, he left his son a kingdom far larger and stronger than the tiny tribe he had inherited. He was buried in a town his family had won, and his tomb became a place his descendants honored for centuries afterward. The patient man who built stone by stone had laid a foundation so deep that it would hold up an empire for more than 600 years. And now the work would pass into the hands of his sons, who would carry the fire much farther than Osman had ever traveled. The son who took up the work was named Orhan, and he proved to be a worthy heir to his careful father. Where Osman had taken small towns, Orhan reached for larger prizes. One of his greatest early victories was the capture of a great city called Bursa, which sat at the foot of a tall green mountain in northwest Anatolia. Bursa was rich, with busy markets, fine buildings, and flowing fountains, and taking it gave the young state a true capital for the first time. No longer would the rulers live only in tents. Now they had a city with stone walls, with mosques and baths and schools, a place where a government could grow. Orhan made Bursa beautiful, building mosques and tombs whose domes still rise above the city today. The tribe now had a home, a fixed heart from which it could reach outward. Orhan understood that an empire needs more than warriors. It needs order, money, and trust. He had coins made that carried his family's name, a small act that meant a great deal, for coins are a sign that a state truly exists and stands behind its own word. He organized how taxes were collected and how justice was given, so that people across his lands knew what to expect. He welcomed scholars and holy men, builders and traders, and his court became a place where learning and faith were honored. Step by step, the rough frontier life of his grandfather's day was giving way to the steady machinery of a real kingdom. The animals and tents had not vanished, but now they sat beside city walls, market squares, and the quiet courtyards of new mosques. Then came a moment that would change the direction of the whole story. Across a narrow stretch of water to the west lay Europe, and the lands of the Byzantine Empire reached onto both shores. The Byzantines, weak and divided, often fought among themselves, and sometimes they even asked the Ottomans for help in their own quarrels. In doing so, they opened a door they could not later close. Orhan's son, a brave young leader named Suleiman, crossed the water with his men and seized a foothold on the European side. For the first time, the family of Osman had set foot on a second continent. It was a quiet crossing, made on boats and rafts under cover of darkness and chance. But its meaning was enormous. The empire that had been born in Asia now had roots in Europe as well, and those roots would grow deep. Once they were across, the Ottomans did not let go. They took the town of Gallipoli, which sat on the European shore, and turned it into a strong base. From there they could move farther into the land called Thrace, a region of rolling fields and old Roman roads. They captured the city of Edirne, which lay deeper in Europe, and made it another seat of their growing power. The story of the small Anatolian tribe was now unfolding on a much larger stage, in lands that had once belonged to ancient Rome and Greece. The herders' descendants were walking through cities older than their own tribe by 1,000 years, and as they moved, they carried with them the same patient methods that had worked from the start, the mixture of war and mercy, of strength and fair rule, that drew people in rather than only crushing them. The speed of this growth surprised even the powers of Europe, who had paid little attention to the small Turkish state for so long. Now they began to notice, with worry, that a new force was rising on their eastern edge. The Ottomans were no longer just one of many groups in Anatolia. They were becoming a bridge between two continents, holding land in both, drawing wealth and soldiers from both. The sons of Osman had taken his quiet dream and made it real on a scale he might never have imagined. And the young state was about to create one of the most unusual and famous armies in all of history, a force that would carry it deep into Europe and make its name feared and respected for centuries. As the empire spread into the Balkans, the wide region of mountains and rivers in southeastern Europe, the Ottomans needed soldiers who would be loyal only to the Sultan and to no one else. The land-holding warriors were useful, but they had their own families and their own interests. The sultans wanted a force that belonged entirely to the state, men with no other loyalty to pull them away. Out of this need came one of the strangest institutions of the age, the corps of soldiers known as the Janissaries. The word means new soldiers, and they were created in a way that seems hard to imagine today. Young Christian boys from the conquered lands of the Balkans were taken from their villages, brought to the capital, raised as Muslims, and trained for years to become elite warriors and servants of the Sultan. This practice was harsh, and it tore many children away from their homes, and we should not pretend otherwise. Yet the system worked in ways that shaped the empire for centuries. The boys were given food, shelter, education, and a path that some peasant families could never have offered. The brightest among them did not become soldiers at all, but rose into the government, and a few even became the most powerful officials in the entire empire, advising the Sultan and ruling provinces. The soldiers among them became the Janissaries, a disciplined standing army at a time when most of Europe still relied on lords gathering their men only when war came. The Janissaries trained constantly, lived together, and marched to the beat of their own military bands, whose deep drums and bright horns could be heard rolling across the fields before a battle even began. With this army and their land-holding cavalry, the Ottomans pushed deeper into Europe. They did not always conquer by force alone. Often, they used a careful mix of war, marriage, and mercy. A local lord might be allowed to keep his lands if he agreed to serve the Sultan and pay his taxes. A noble family might be joined to the Ottomans through marriage, tying their fortunes together. Towns that surrendered peacefully were treated far more gently than towns that resisted, and word of this spread quickly, so that many places chose to open their gates. People of different faiths were allowed to keep their religions and live under their own community leaders, as long as they stayed loyal and paid what was owed. This made the empire something a great many people could live within, even if they were not Turks and not Muslims. Then came a sudden and frightening blow that nearly ended the whole story. Far to the east, a great conqueror named Timur, also known as Tamerlane, swept across Asia with a terrible army. The Ottoman Sultan of that time, a bold and proud man called Bayezid, marched out to meet him. The two armies clashed in a huge battle near Ankara, and the Ottomans were crushed. Sultan Bayezid himself was captured and died as a prisoner. For a moment, it looked as if the young empire might simply fall apart, for Bayezid's sons turned against one another and fought a long and bitter civil war for the throne. The lands their family had gathered over 100 years seemed about to scatter like seeds in the wind. But the foundations Osman and his sons had laid were stronger than they looked. After years of struggle, one of the sons won the throne and slowly pulled the broken empire back together. The cities returned to obedience, the army was rebuilt, and the borders were restored and then pushed outward once more. The recovery showed something important about this empire. It could take a terrible blow, fall into chaos, and still survive, because its roots ran so deep into the land and its people. The Janissaries marched again, the land-holding cavalry rode again, and the green and crescent banners rose once more over the towns of the Balkans and Anatolia. With the empire whole again and growing stronger, the rulers now turned their eyes toward the greatest prize of all, a city that had stood unconquered for 1,000 years. That city was Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire. And to understand why it mattered so much, you have to understand how long it had stood and how strong it was. Constantinople had been founded more than 1,000 years before by a Roman emperor named Constantine, and for all those centuries it had been one of the greatest cities in the world. It sat on a point of land where Europe met Asia, with water on 3 sides, guarding the narrow passage between 2 seas. Through its harbors flowed the trade of the whole region, silk and spice, grain and gold, and the city had grown rich beyond imagining. Its great church, called Hagia Sophia, was crowned with an enormous dome that seemed to float in the air, and travelers who saw it said it was like standing inside heaven itself. What made Constantinople almost impossible to take were its walls. Around the landward side of the city stood a triple line of mighty walls, built layer upon layer, with deep ditches in front and tall towers along their length. These walls had stood for 1,000 years and had turned back army after army. Many had tried to break them, and almost all had failed. Behind those walls, the people of the city had always felt safe, believing that God himself protected them and that the great stones would never fall. The walls were so famous that the very idea of taking the city seemed like a dream that could never come true. To capture Constantinople would be to do what no army had managed for 1,000 years. Yet by the middle of the 1400s, the once mighty Byzantine Empire had shrunk to almost nothing. Where it had once ruled vast lands across many regions, now it held little more than the city itself and a few scattered pieces of territory. The Ottoman Empire surrounded it on every side, in Europe and in Asia, like a great sea around a small and fading island. The city that had once been the center of a huge empire was now a lonely jewel, beautiful but weak, its population shrunken, many of its grand buildings empty or crumbling. The emperor still wore his crown and held his court, but his power reached barely beyond the walls. Everyone could see that the end was coming. The only question was who would take the city and when. For the Ottomans, Constantinople was more than just a rich prize. It sat right in the middle of their lands, dividing their European territories from their Asian ones, a foreign island in the heart of their empire. As long as it stood in Christian hands, it was a thorn, a reminder of unfinished work, and a possible base for their enemies. To take it would be to join their 2 halves into one whole, to gain a magnificent capital, and to win glory that would echo through all the ages. Earlier, sultans had tried and failed to break the walls, and each failure made the city seem even more unconquerable. But a new sultan was rising, a young man with a burning ambition and a sharp and patient mind, who had dreamed of taking the city since he was a boy. In the quiet years before the Great Siege, both sides could feel the storm gathering. The young sultan built a strong fortress on the European shore, right at the narrowest point of the water, so that he could cut the city off from help and supplies coming by sea. The people of Constantinople watched these preparations with growing fear, knowing what they meant. They sent messages to the kingdoms of Europe, begging for help, but the help that came was small and slow. Inside the walls, the people prayed, repaired the stones as best they could, and gathered what soldiers they had, which were far too few. Outside, the Ottoman army grew larger and larger, and strange new weapons were being made that would change the rules of war forever. The 1,000-year story of the Great Walls was about to reach its final chapter. The young sultan who would lead this attack was named Mehmed II, and he was only about 21 years old when the siege began. Do not let his youth fool you. He was clever, fierce, and deeply learned, able to read several languages and fascinated by history, science, and the great conquerors of the past. He had dreamed of taking Constantinople for as long as he could remember, and now, with the throne in his hands, he gave the city everything he had. He gathered an enormous army, far larger than the small force inside the walls, and he brought to the siege a weapon that the world had rarely seen used on such a scale. He had ordered the building of giant cannons, the largest the world had yet known, monstrous guns that could hurl stone balls weighing as much as a man across great distances. One of these cannons was so huge that it took dozens of oxen and hundreds of men to drag it slowly along the roads to the city. It could only be fired a few times a day, for it had to cool down between shots, and loading it was slow and dangerous work. But when it fired, the sound was like thunder splitting the sky, and the ground shook for miles around. The great stone ball would smash into the ancient walls with a force no builder had ever planned for these walls had been raised in an age before such guns existed. Slowly, day after day, the cannons pounded the stones that had stood for 1,000 years. The defenders worked through every night to patch the broken places with earth, wood, and rubble, but the damage grew faster than they could repair it. Inside the city, the people lived in growing dread, yet they did not give up. The emperor, a brave man named Constantine, the last of his line, walked the walls and encouraged his soldiers, refusing every offer to flee and save himself. The defenders were terribly few, only a handful of thousands against an army of many tens of thousands. They came from many places, some local, some volunteers from across the sea, who had chosen to stand and fight beside them. By day, they faced the cannons and the arrows. By night, they prayed in the great churches, the candlelight flickering on the golden walls of Hagia Sophia, the air thick with incense and fear. They knew the odds. They knew that no help was coming in time. And still, they held day after day, week after week. Mehmed faced a serious problem. The city's harbor was protected by a great chain stretched across the water, so that no Ottoman ship could sail in to attack from that side. The chain was heavy and strong, and it had kept the harbor safe for a long time. So Mehmed did something so bold that people could hardly believe it. He had his men build a road of greased wooden planks over a hill of land, and then, with ropes and oxen and the strength of thousands of soldiers, they dragged dozens of ships up out of the water, over the land, and down again into the protected harbor on the other side of the chain. One morning, the defenders looked out and saw Ottoman ships floating in waters they had thought were safe, and their hearts sank. The young sultan had moved an entire fleet over dry land. The siege went on for nearly 2 months, and both sides grew exhausted. The walls were broken in many places now, patched and broken and patched again. The defenders were worn down, fewer each day, weary beyond words. At last, Mehmed decided the time had come for the final assault. In the dark hours before dawn, he sent wave after wave of soldiers against the battered walls. First came the less trained men, then stronger troops, and finally his best soldiers, the disciplined Janissaries, marching to the beat of their drums. 3 times the defenders threw them back, fighting with the strength of those who know there is nowhere left to run. The fighting was fierce and terrible, and the cost on both sides was high. This part of the story must be told honestly, even in a quiet telling like this one, for many brave people on both sides died that morning beneath the old stones. Then a small gate was found left open, and Ottoman soldiers poured through, and at almost the same moment the defenders saw their banners rise upon the walls. The last emperor, Constantine, threw off the marks of his rank and rushed into the fighting like an ordinary soldier, and he was never seen alive again, vanishing into the chaos of that final morning. The 1,000-year city had fallen. After more than 1,000 years, the great walls had finally been broken, and the ancient capital of Rome's last heir passed into new hands. When Mehmed rode into the city, it is said that he went straight to the great church of Hagia Sophia, and standing beneath that vast floating dome, he was moved by its beauty and ordered that it be protected. The date was the year 1453, and the world had changed forever. The fall of Constantinople sent a shock across the whole world. In the kingdoms of Europe, the news was met with grief and fear, for the city had seemed eternal, and now it was gone. For the Ottomans, it was the greatest triumph in their history, the moment a frontier tribe became a true empire with a capital worthy of its power. Mehmed, only 21, was now known as the Conqueror, a name he would carry for the rest of his life and into all the histories that followed. He had done what no leader had managed for 1,000 years, and he did not see himself merely as a destroyer of the old city. He saw himself as its new master and its rebuilder, the heir to its long story, and he set out at once to make it the heart of a new and even greater empire. Mehmed found a city that was half empty and worn down, its population shrunken by the long centuries of Byzantine decline. He set out to fill it with life again. He invited people from all over his empire to come and settle there, offering them homes and chances to build new lives. He welcomed not only Muslims, but also Christians and Jews, for he understood that a great city needs many hands and many kinds of skill. Merchants, builders, scholars, and craftsmen came from far and wide. The markets filled again with goods from across the empire and beyond, with the smell of spices and roasting food, the calls of sellers, and the bustle of a city coming back to life. Streets that had stood silent began to ring with footsteps and voices once more, and the city, now called Istanbul, slowly grew into one of the largest and richest places on earth. Mehmed rebuilt and reshaped the city with care. He repaired its old buildings and raised grand new ones, including mosques, schools, and a great covered market where thousands of shops sold goods of every kind. He built a magnificent palace, later known as the Topkapi Palace, which sat on a point of land with views over the water on both sides, where the sultans would live and rule for centuries to come. He drew clear water into the city and saw to its defenses and its trade. He was not only a warrior, but a ruler who thought about how a vast realm should be governed, and he gathered learned men around him to help him write laws and organize his growing empire. Under his hand, the conquered city became a worthy seat for a power that now stretched across 2 continents. One of the wisest things Mehmed did was to let the many different peoples of his empire keep their own faiths and customs while living under his rule. The empire was home to Muslims, Christians of several kinds, and Jews, and they did not all live the same way or pray the same way. Mehmed allowed each major religious community to manage many of its own affairs, with its own leaders settling disputes and looking after its people, as long as they stayed loyal and paid their taxes. This system gave the empire a kind of order that allowed very different peoples to live side by side without constant war between them. It was not perfect, and the different groups were not treated as equals, but for its time it was remarkably workable, and it helped hold a huge and varied empire together for a very long time. By the time Mehmed the Conqueror died, the Ottoman state had become something entirely new. It was no longer a frontier kingdom, but a great empire with a famous capital, a strong army, a growing fleet, and lands reaching across Europe and Asia. The small dream of Osman, of a tree whose branches covered the world, had grown into something solid and vast. Yet the empire was still hungry to grow, and the next great sultans would carry it onto a third continent and into a golden age that people would remember for centuries. The story now turns to a sultan who looked not west into Europe, but south and east, toward ancient lands and the very holiest places of the Muslim world. This sultan was Selim I, a stern and powerful man remembered as Selim the Grim, and his reign was short, but he changed the map of the empire forever. While earlier sultans had focused on Europe, Selim turned his armies toward the east and the south, into lands of deserts and ancient cities. To the east lay a rival empire ruled by a different branch of Islam, and to the south lay the rich kingdom of the Mamluks, who ruled Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Lands of Arabia. Selim was a soldier through and through, hard and unbending, and he led his armies on long and difficult marches across mountains and dry country, places where heat and thirst could kill as surely as any enemy. His men feared him and followed him, and under his command they won victories that doubled the size of the empire in only a few years. First, Selim turned east and met the army of his great rival in a tremendous battle on a wide plain. The Ottomans brought with them their cannons and their handheld guns, weapons their enemies had far fewer of, and these guns helped decide the day. The thunder of the cannons and the crackle of gunfire shattered the charging cavalry of the other side, and Selim won a great victory that secured his eastern border. Then he turned south against the Mamluks of Egypt and Syria. Again, the Ottoman guns proved their worth, for the Mamluks were brave and proud warriors who fought in the old way on horseback, but they could not stand against the new weapons. In a series of fierce battles, Selim broke their power, and the ancient lands of Syria and Egypt fell under Ottoman rule. With the conquest of Egypt came something that gave the Ottoman sultans a new and far heavier kind of authority. The Mamluks had been the protectors of the holiest cities of Islam, the cities of Mecca and Medina in Arabia, where the faith had been born and where millions of believers turned in prayer each day. Now that role passed to the Ottoman Sultan. Selim became the guardian of these sacred places, the protector of the pilgrims who traveled there each year, and the keeper of the holy cities. This made the Ottoman ruler not just a king of many lands, but a central figure of the whole Muslim world, a defender of the faith itself. The title and the duty that came with it would be carried by Ottoman sultans for the next 400 years, and it gave the empire a weight and a meaning far beyond its borders. With Egypt under his rule, Selim now controlled lands on a third continent, in Africa, joining his territories in Europe and Asia. The empire that had begun as a tribe in Anatolia now stretched across 3 continents at once, holding ancient cities, fertile river valleys, busy ports, and the holiest places of the faith. The grain of Egypt, one of the richest farming lands in the world, now flowed into the empire's storehouses. The trade routes that carried spices and silk passed through Ottoman hands. The wealth and the power of the empire grew enormously in just a few short years under Selim's hard and tireless rule. He had taken the empire that Mehmed left him and nearly doubled it, laying the ground for the greatest period of all. Selim did not live long after these conquests, and he died after only about 8 years on the throne, worn out perhaps by the same fierce energy that had driven his victories. But he left to his son an empire larger, richer, and more powerful than any of his ancestors had ever known. The lands stretched from deep in Europe to the deserts of Arabia, from the river valleys of Egypt to the mountains of the East. The treasury was full, the army was strong and seasoned, and the empire held the keys to holy cities and rich trade. Into this inheritance stepped his son, a young man who would become the most famous Ottoman ruler of all, the one under whom the empire would reach the very height of its glory. His name was Suleiman, and the world would come to call him the Magnificent. Suleiman came to the throne as a young man, and he would rule for nearly 50 years, one of the longest reigns in all the empire's history. He was everything the moment called for. He was a brave soldier who led his armies in person, a wise lawmaker who shaped the empire's rules for centuries, a patron of art and beauty who filled his cities with masterpieces, and a ruler of dignity and intelligence who commanded respect across the whole world. In his time, the Ottoman Empire reached the very peak of its strength and splendor. It was perhaps the most powerful state on earth, and certainly one of the richest and largest. The boy who had inherited a great empire would leave it greater still, and his long reign would be remembered as the Golden Age, the bright summit of the whole Ottoman story. Suleiman continued the conquests of his fathers, and under him the empire pushed deeper into Europe than ever before. He marched into the Kingdom of Hungary, in the heart of Central Europe, and at a great battle on a wide plain, he shattered the Hungarian army and broke its power in a single day. The Ottomans now ruled much of Hungary, bringing their armies and their banners far into the European interior, into lands of green hills, broad rivers, and old stone castles. His fleets meanwhile ruled much of the Mediterranean Sea, raiding distant coasts and challenging the great Christian sea powers. His admirals became famous and feared across the water, and the Ottoman navy carried the empire's strength to ports far from home. On land and on sea, the empire seemed unstoppable, a power that reached across the known world. But Suleiman is not remembered only for his wars. To his own people, he was known by a different name, the lawgiver, for he brought order and fairness to the empire's vast and tangled system of rules. He worked to make the laws clear and just, so that people across his many lands knew their rights and their duties, and so that the powerful could not simply do as they pleased to the weak. He cared about justice for ordinary people, and stories were told of how he listened to the complaints of common folk and punished officials who abused their power. He built a system of government and law so well ordered that it held the empire together long after he was gone. To rule fairly over so many different peoples, faiths, and lands was a great achievement, and it is why his own people honored him as much for his laws as for his victories. Suleiman's reign was also a time of breathtaking beauty, and much of that beauty came from one extraordinary man, his chief architect, named Sinan. Sinan was a genius of stone and space, And over his long life, he designed hundreds of buildings across the empire, including mosques, bridges, baths, and schools. His greatest works were grand mosques crowned with soaring domes, vast and graceful spaces filled with light from rows of windows, decorated with beautiful tiles in deep blues and bright reds. To step inside one of Sinan's great mosques was to feel small beneath a sky of stone, the air cool and still, the light falling softly from high above, the sound of footsteps echoing in the wide and peaceful space. These buildings still stand today, hundreds of years later, and they remain among the most beautiful in the world, a lasting gift from the golden age of the empire. The court of Suleiman was a place of dazzling splendor, and visitors from distant kingdoms came away amazed at its wealth and its order. The Sultan sat in his great palace surrounded by silk and gold, by gardens and fountains, by servants and soldiers and scholars from across his vast lands. Ambassadors brought rich gifts and treated him with deep respect, for his power touched the affairs of every nation. The markets of his cities overflowed with goods from 3 continents, and the treasury was full of gold and silver flowing in from taxes, trade, and tribute. The empire seemed to stand at the center of the world, a meeting place of East and West, a power that no one could ignore and few could match. This was the high summer of the Ottoman story, the moment when the tree of Osman's dream truly seemed to shade the whole world. Yet even at this great height, the seeds of future trouble were quietly present, though no one could see them clearly yet. The empire had grown so large that ruling it was a heavy burden, and the next sultans would not all share Suleiman's strength and wisdom. The way the throne passed from father to son could lead to deadly struggles among brothers and sons. And in the courts of Europe, new powers were rising, learning and growing stronger, even as they trembled before the Ottoman armies. But all of that lay in the future. For now, under Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire stood at its peak, vast and rich and proud, holding 3 continents in its hand. And the armies of this golden age were about to march to the farthest point they would ever reach in Europe, to the gates of a great city that would mark the very edge of their power. That city was Vienna, the proud capital deep in Central Europe, and the Ottoman march toward it tells us much about both the empire's strength and its limits. After conquering Hungary, Suleiman pushed his armies farther north and west, deeper into Europe than any Ottoman force had gone before. The goal was Vienna, a key city that guarded the road into the heart of the continent. To take it would be to open the way to even greater conquests. So Suleiman gathered a huge army and set out on the long march, with his soldiers, his cannons, his supply wagons, and his thousands of pack animals stretching for miles along the muddy roads. It was an enormous undertaking, moving such a force across such a great distance, far from the heart of the empire, but distance itself became an enemy. Vienna lay so far from the Ottoman heartland that the great army could only reach it after months of marching, and only late in the year, when the season was turning cold and wet. The roads turned to mud beneath the autumn rains, and the heavy guns, the same kind of mighty cannons that had broken the walls of Constantinople, were hard to drag through the mire over such long distances. Some of the largest guns had to be left behind, and the army arrived before Vienna without the full strength of its siege power. The men were tired from the long road, the weather was growing harsher, and supplies were stretched thin across the vast distance from home. The empire had reached the very edge of what its power could carry. The siege of Vienna was hard fought, but the city held. The defenders, knowing what was coming, had strengthened their walls and gathered their strength. The Ottomans dug tunnels beneath the walls and set off charges to blow holes in them, and several times they nearly broke through, pouring into the gaps in fierce and bloody attacks. But the defenders fought back with desperate courage, sealing the breaches and throwing the attackers out again. The cold rains kept falling, sickness spread through the Ottoman camp, food ran short, and the season grew dangerous for an army so far from home. At last, Suleiman saw that the city would not fall before winter, and he gave the order to lift the siege and march back the long way home. The greatest army in the world had been turned away. The failure to take Vienna did not destroy the empire or even truly weaken it, for it remained immensely powerful for a long time afterward. But it marked something important. It showed the limit of how far Ottoman power could reach. The empire could conquer lands close to its heart with ease, but the farther its armies marched from home, the harder it became to feed them, to supply them, and to bring up the great guns they needed to break strong walls. Vienna sat just beyond that limit, at the very edge of what the empire could grasp. The high tide of Ottoman expansion into Europe had reached its farthest mark and begun, ever so slowly, to turn. It would be many years before anyone could clearly see it, but the wave had touched its highest point upon the shore. For now, though, the empire remained vast and feared, and Suleiman returned home to rule for many more years in splendor and strength. He would try once more to push into Central Europe in later years, but Vienna would remain just out of reach. When he finally died, an old man after nearly half a century on the throne, he was on campaign still, in the field with his army as he had been so often in his long life. His passing marked the end of the Golden Age, the close of the brightest chapter in the empire's story. The sultans who came after him would face a changing world and changing challenges, and much of the real power in the empire would begin to shift away from the battlefield and into the quiet halls and hidden rooms of the great palace itself. To understand the empire after Suleiman, we have to step inside the palace walls, into a world far from the noise of battle. The early sultans had been warriors who led their armies in person and won their thrones by strength and skill. But over time, this began to change. The sultans came to spend more of their lives inside the great palace, raised in its sheltered rooms rather than tested in war and government as young men. The palace was a world of its own, with its courtyards and gardens, its servants and guards, its quiet chambers, and its strict rules. At its heart lay the harem, the private household of the sultan, where his family, his mother, his wives, and their children lived, hidden away from the outside world behind high walls and locked doors. Within this hidden world, a quiet kind of power grew, and it shaped the empire in ways the old warriors could never have imagined. The mother of the sultan, in particular, often became one of the most powerful people in the whole empire. Because the sultan was her son, and because she had spent her life in the heart of the palace, she understood its workings better than almost anyone. She could influence who advised the sultan, who rose and who fell, and how decisions were made. In some periods, when the sultans were young, weak, or uninterested in ruling, it was the sultan's mother and the women and officials of the inner court who truly steered the empire. This time is sometimes remembered as an age when power flowed through the palace rather than from the saddle of a war horse. The way princes were raised also changed, and this change had deep effects. In the early days, young princes had been sent out to govern provinces, learning the hard work of ruling, leading armies, and making decisions while their fathers still lived. This prepared them, but it also led to terrible struggles, for when a sultan died, his sons would often fight one another for the throne, and the losers were usually killed. To prevent these deadly wars, the empire changed its ways. Princes were now kept within the palace, raised in comfort, but also in a kind of soft imprisonment, sheltered from the world. This spared many lives and prevented many wars, but it also meant that some sultans came to the throne having never governed anything, never led an army, never learned the hard skills of rule. The throne sometimes passed to men who were unready for the weight it carried. Power also shifted toward the great officials of the government, especially the Grand Vizier, who was the chief minister of the empire. When a sultan was weak or uninterested, a strong and able Grand Vizier could rule in his place, running the armies, the treasury, and the provinces. At times, the empire was fortunate, and a gifted family of viziers held the government together with skill and care, guiding it through difficult years. At other times, the officials quarreled among themselves, and corruption and intrigue spread through the court. The fate of the empire came to depend a great deal on whether the people around the sultan were wise and honest or greedy and foolish. The machine of government that Suleiman had built was strong, and it could run for a long time even when the man at its center was not a great leader. But it could not run forever without care. This was a quieter, more inward chapter in the empire's life, away from the great battles and conquests of earlier days. The empire was still vast, still rich, still home to millions of people across 3 continents. Life in its great cities went on much as before, with the markets busy, the mosques full, and the trade flowing. But the energy that had driven the empire ever outward was beginning to fade, replaced by the slower rhythms of palace life and court politics. The world outside, meanwhile, was not standing still. In the kingdoms of Europe, new ideas, new weapons, new ways of trade and war were taking shape and growing stronger. The empire that had once led the world in so many ways would soon find itself struggling to keep pace, and the long years of war that lay ahead would test it as never before. The wars with the powers of Europe did not stop after Suleiman, and over time they grew harder and less rewarding for the empire. For a long while, the Ottomans and their Christian neighbors fought back and forth along the borders, winning and losing towns and fortresses, with neither side able to land a final blow. The empire was still powerful enough to be feared, and more than once it gathered its strength for great campaigns. But the easy conquests of the early days were gone. The lands near the borders had already been taken, and pushing farther meant fighting strong and determined enemies far from home, the same problem that had turned the army back from Vienna long before. The wars became long and grinding, costly in lives and treasure, and they no longer brought the rich rewards they once had. Late in the 1600s, the empire made one last great effort to take the prize that had escaped Suleiman. A powerful and ambitious Grand Vizier gathered a huge army and marched once more on Vienna, hoping to finally break the city that guarded the road into the heart of Europe. The Ottomans laid siege to Vienna a second time, surrounding it and pounding its defenses, and for weeks the city teetered on the edge of falling. The defenders held on with desperate hope, waiting for help that they prayed would come in time. And it did come. A great army of allied Christian kingdoms marched to the rescue, and in a tremendous battle outside the walls, they fell upon the Ottoman forces and shattered them. The siege was broken, and the Ottoman army was driven back in defeat. This second failure at Vienna was far more serious than the first, for it did not end in an orderly retreat, but in a true and lasting turn of the tide. After this defeat, the empire's enemies pressed forward, no longer simply defending but now attacking, pushing into Ottoman lands. A great alliance of European powers made war on the empire for years, and slowly the Ottomans were forced back. Hungary, which Suleiman had won in his glory, was lost. Town after town, fortress after fortress, passed out of Ottoman hands. For the first time in the empire's long history, it was forced to sign a treaty that gave away large lands to its enemies, an admission that it had truly lost and could not win them back. The borders that had only ever grown were now, plainly and undeniably, beginning to shrink. It is hard to describe how great a change this was in the spirit of the empire. For more than 300 years, the Ottoman story had been one of growth, of armies marching outward, of new lands and new wealth flowing in. The sultans had been conquerors, and the empire had measured itself by how far its power reached. Now, for the first time, the story had reversed. The empire was on the defensive, fighting not to gain but to hold, and losing even so. The proud armies that had once made all of Europe tremble were now being beaten and driven back. The change was slow, spread over many years, but its direction was clear. The empire had passed its peak, and the long, slow descent had begun. A descent that would last for more than 200 years. Yet even now, in defeat, the empire did not collapse. It was still enormous, still home to vast lands and millions of people across 3 continents. It still had its great cities, its trade, its faith, and its deep roots. It could still raise large armies and win battles when fortune favored it. The decline was not a sudden fall, but a slow fading, like a long afternoon turning gently toward evening. The empire would endure for many more generations, struggling, reforming, fighting, and holding on, even as the world changed around it and its rivals grew ever stronger. The story now becomes one of survival rather than conquest, of an old and weary giant trying to keep its feet as the ground shifted beneath it and the lands at its edges began, one by one, to slip away. In the long years that followed, throughout the 1700s and into the 1800s, the empire found itself falling behind the changing world, and the cost of that was heavy. In Europe, great changes were sweeping through the kingdoms. New ideas in science and government, new ways of making weapons and goods, new armies trained and equipped in new ways. All of these made the European powers stronger and stronger. The empire, which had once led the world, was slow to change its old ways, and so it fell behind. Its armies, once the most feared on earth, now struggled against the better trained and better armed forces of its rivals. Wars that the empire would once have won were now lost, and each loss meant more land, more people, and more wealth slipping away. To the north, a great and growing power pressed hard against the empire, hungry for its lands and its warm water ports. War followed war, and time after time the Ottomans were beaten and forced to give up territory along their northern borders. Whole regions that had been Ottoman for centuries were lost. Far away in the rich province of Egypt, the heart of the empire's African lands, local rulers grew strong and began to act on their own, no longer truly obeying the distant sultan. In the Balkans, in Europe, the many peoples who had lived under Ottoman rule for so long began to dream of ruling themselves, of having their own nations and their own freedom. One by one, these peoples would rise up and break away, taking pieces of the empire with them. The other powers of Europe watched the slow weakening of the empire with great interest, and they began to call it by a name that captured its sad new state. They called it the sick man of Europe, an old and ailing giant whose lands the stronger nations eyed with greed. They schemed and competed over what would happen to its vast territories if it should finally fall apart, each hoping to gain a share for itself. This was a bitter change for an empire that had once made those same nations tremble. The proud power that had taken Constantinople and stood at the gates of Vienna was now seen as a dying man whose inheritance the others were already quarreling over. And yet, even sick and shrinking, the empire clung to life with surprising strength, refusing to fall, holding on year after year. The losses came steadily through these long years, and each one was a wound. In the Balkans, the peoples of the region rose up and won their freedom one after another, carving new nations out of lands that had been Ottoman for hundreds of years. Greece broke away after a long and bitter struggle. Other regions followed, each declaring itself free, each taking its piece of the old empire. To the north and east, more wars brought more losses. The map of the empire, which had once spread so wide across 3 continents, shrank inward bit by bit, like a great pool of water slowly drying in the sun. Each lost province was a blow not only to the empire's strength, but to its pride and its sense of itself as a great and growing power. Yet through all these losses, the empire endured, and that endurance is itself a remarkable thing. It did not fall apart all at once, as many expected it might. It hung on decade after decade, holding its core lands together even as its edges crumbled away. The great cities still stood, the trade still flowed, the faith still bound the people together, and the long traditions of government still functioned, however imperfectly. The empire was wounded and shrinking, but it was not yet dead, and within it, thoughtful people began to ask a hard question. If the empire was falling behind the world, then perhaps it could change. Perhaps it could learn from its rivals, reform its ways, and find new strength. And so, even in its long decline, the empire began one of the bravest and most difficult struggles of its whole history, the struggle to remake itself and survive. This great effort to change the empire is remembered as the Age of Reform, and it filled much of the 1800s with hope and struggle. The leaders of the empire, both sultans and ministers, came to see that the old ways were no longer enough, and that the empire must modernize or die. So they set out to remake it. They reorganized the army along modern lines, training and arming it in the new ways of Europe, hoping to build a force that could stand against the empire's enemies once more. The old core of the Janissaries, once the pride of the empire but now resistant to change and full of trouble, was finally and forcefully done away with, clearing the path for a new kind of army. It was a hard and painful step, but the reformers believed it was necessary. The reforms reached far beyond the army. The leaders worked to remake the whole empire, its laws, its schools, and its government. They created new schools where young people could learn modern subjects, science, languages, and the knowledge of the wider world. They reformed the laws, trying to make them fairer and clearer, and to give the many different peoples of the empire a greater sense of belonging and equal treatment under the law. They built new roads, brought in the telegraph for fast communication across the vast empire, and later laid railways that could carry people and goods across great distances. They tried to modernize the government, to make it more orderly and efficient, more like the strong states of Europe. This time of great change was known as the Tanzimat, a word meaning reorganization, and it was a bold attempt to give the old empire a new future. The reformers faced enormous difficulties, for changing such a vast and varied empire was like trying to turn a great ship in a narrow channel. The empire was home to so many different peoples, faiths, and languages, spread across 3 continents, and not all of them wanted the same things. Some welcomed the reforms and the chance for a better and fairer life. Others resisted, clinging to old ways or fearing the loss of their power and privileges. The reforms cost a great deal of money, and the empire, weakened by years of war and loss, often struggled to pay for them, falling deep into debt to foreign banks and powers. And all the while, the empire's enemies continued to press against its borders, and its provinces continued to slip away, so that the reformers were trying to rebuild the ship, even as the storm tore at its sides. There were brave and gifted people in these years who gave their lives to the work of saving the empire, and their efforts deserve to be remembered. Ministers labored to write new laws and build new schools. Officers worked to train the new army. Thinkers and writers dreamed of how the empire might become a modern nation, where all its peoples could live together as equals. For a time, the empire even had a written constitution and a parliament where representatives of its different peoples could gather and speak, a remarkable thing for its day. Yet these hopeful steps were fragile, and they were often undone by the pressures of war, the resistance of powerful men, and the sheer difficulty of changing so old and so vast a realm. The empire reached hard for a future it could feel slipping away, and its reformers worked against time itself. Despite all their efforts, the deep troubles of the empire could not be fully cured. The losses continued. More provinces broke away or were taken. The empire grew smaller and weaker, even as it modernized in many ways. The reforms made it stronger than it would otherwise have been, and they left a lasting mark that would shape the lands of the region long after the empire was gone. But they could not reverse the long tide of decline. The empire was caught in a hard place, too weak to defend all its lands, yet too large and too proud to simply give up. It struggled on into a new century, into a world of even greater dangers, where a single great war was gathering on the horizon, a storm so vast that it would sweep away not only the Ottoman Empire, but several of the great old empires of the world. The final chapter of the empire's long life came with that great war, the terrible conflict that the world would later call the First World War, and it brought the 600-year story to its close. As the new century began, the empire was weak and shrinking, and it had lost most of its lands in Europe and much of its strength. When the Great War broke out among the powers of the world, the empire chose to join one side, hoping that victory might restore some of its lost glory and protect it from its enemies. It was a fateful choice. The empire threw its tired strength into a war far larger than any it had fought before. A war of vast armies, terrible new weapons, and suffering on a scale never seen. Its soldiers fought hard and bravely in many places, and at times they won real victories against great odds. But the war was long and brutal, and it brought immense suffering to the lands and peoples of the empire. These years also saw some of the darkest events in the empire's history, a time of great violence and terrible loss of life among its peoples, events that must be acknowledged honestly even in a quiet telling such as this one. War, hunger, and disease swept across the land, and many hundreds of thousands of people died. The empire poured out its remaining strength on distant battlefields, and slowly that strength was used up. Its allies grew weaker, its enemies grew stronger, and the long struggle ground the old empire down. By the war's end, the empire was exhausted, defeated, and broken, its army spent, its treasury empty, its lands occupied by foreign forces. When the Great War ended in defeat, the empire that had ruled 3 continents lay shattered. The victorious powers moved to divide its remaining lands among themselves and among the peoples who had broken free. Foreign soldiers occupied its capital, the great city of Istanbul that Mehmed had conquered and rebuilt so long ago. and the proud heart of the empire fell under foreign control. It seemed that the long story was truly over, that the tree of Osman's old dream had at last been cut down. The empire that had stood for more than 6 centuries, that had taken Constantinople and stood at the gates of Vienna, that had ruled lands in Europe, Asia, and Africa, was being carved apart and shared out among others. After so many centuries, the end had come. But out of this defeat and ruin, something new arose. In the heartland of the empire, in Anatolia, where the whole story had begun so long ago, a movement of national resistance rose up, led by able and determined people who refused to accept the carving up of their homeland. They gathered the will and the strength of the people, and they fought a hard war to drive out the occupying forces and to win their independence. From this struggle came not a restored empire, but a new nation, a modern republic built upon the Anatolian core of the old Ottoman lands. The age of the sultans was over. The last sultan left the throne, and the empire that Osman had founded so many centuries before came formally and finally to its end, replaced by a new country looking toward a new future. And so, the long story closed, more than 600 years after a small tribe of herders had first begun to gather around a patient leader on the edge of a dying world. The empire had risen from almost nothing, climbed to rule 3 continents, shone in a golden age of beauty and power, and then slowly faded through long centuries of decline before its final fall. It was one of the longest lasting and most remarkable empires in all of human history, and the lands it once ruled would carry its mark forever. The crescent banners had been lowered, the sultans had passed into memory, and the great empire had become a part of the past. Yet its long shadow would linger across the 3 continents it had once held, in ways both large and small, for generations still to come. We have come a long way together tonight, all the way from a single felt tent on a quiet frontier to the close of a 600-year story. The empire is gone now, but it never truly vanished. You can still feel its presence across the 3 continents it once held, in the great mosques whose domes still rise over old cities, in the foods and the words and the customs shared across many lands, in the borders and the cities that still carry the shape the empire gave them. Walk through the old quarters of Istanbul today, and the past is all around you, in the worn stones, the covered markets, and the great dome of Hagia Sophia still floating above it all. Picture that city now, in the soft hours of the night. The great mosques stand quiet beneath the stars, their domes dark against the sky. The waters between the 2 continents move slowly, gentle and endless, the same waters that ships were once dragged across so long ago. The markets are still, the streets are calm, and the old walls rest in the dark as they have for so many centuries, keeping their long memories. After all the marching and building, all the rising and falling, the old empire has settled at last into a deep and peaceful stillness, like a great and weary traveler finally come home to rest. Thank you for staying with me on this long journey through the centuries. Rest well now, and let the old stories settle softly around you as you drift toward sleep. Good night, dear listeners, and may your rest be deep and peaceful.